The impossible secret of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in New Orleans, 1852, in the suffocating heat of late spring, when the air in New Orleans felt thick enough to swallow breath. Every major paper whispered the same impossible headline. On a single morning in May, at the St. Louis Hotel auction block, a young man was sold for a sum so obscene it rattled the foundations of Southern wealth. He was barely into manhood, his face unmarked by labor, his posture calm in a place where fear usually screamed from the eyes. They praised him openly, shamelessly, calling him the most beautiful male slave ever displayed beneath those chandeliers. But beauty was not what unsettled the room. Beauty was only the distraction. What followed the auction never appeared in print. No reporter dared describe the way seasoned traders went silent when he stepped forward. No column mentioned the way 7 witnesses later swore, hands trembling on Bibles, that the man on that platform should not have existed at all, not because of his appearance but because of his identity. His very presence violated laws older than the city itself. The wealthiest families in New Orleans turned on one another that day, bidding with a desperation that felt less like desire and more like panic. One family won. Within months, their name would rot into scandal, ruin, and whispered terror. The records of the sale were locked away by legislative order, sealed so tightly that even historians learned to stop asking. Yet one question remained festering in the dark. Why would anyone pay a fortune for a man who by law was already free? The answer begins far from the echoing auction hall, upriver where the Mississippi bends like a coiled serpent. There stood Rivier Okan Plantation, a sugar empire so prosperous it barely needed to acknowledge the outside world. It does not appear on modern maps. Perhaps it never truly wanted to be found. For decades it belonged to the Dearu family, Creole aristocrat, who traced their blood to France and their authority to a time before America claimed Louisiana. Their land breathed wealth, order, and a silence that felt carefully enforced. The plantation house rose in pale grandeur, its imported columns holding up galleries that watched the river like unblinking eyes. Moss-laden oaks formed a living tunnel along the approach, their shadows swallowing visitors whole before releasing them at the steps. Some found the sight beautiful, others felt watched. The Dearu family believed both reactions were appropriate. Monsieur Anatol Dearu ruled this world with immaculate precision. Widowed, devout, and meticulous, he trusted ledgers more than people. Every transaction was recorded, every number checked twice, every human life on his land reduced to ink and tally. He spoke of mercy and Christian duty while owning hundreds of souls. In his mind there was no contradiction. Order was righteousness. Control was kindness. His brother Christophe was the flaw in that perfect system. Where Anatol valued discipline, Christophe adored excess. Music, poetry, charm, and debt followed him wherever he went. When their father died, Anatol inherited the plantation and its power, while Christophe received money and a warning to never return. He left for Paris and became exactly what Anatol feared. Letters arrived filled with laughter, art, and indulgence, always ending with requests for funds. Anatol paid them without comment. Peace, after all, had its price. Then came the letter that changed everything. Christophe announced his marriage with breathless excitement. Enclosed was an image so intimate it felt intrusive. A delicate photograph capturing a young woman with eyes too knowing for her age. Her name was Celeste. Her beauty was quiet, unsettling, and to Anatol's trained eye, her ancestry was unmistakable. Not enough to scandalize Paris, perhaps. Enough to shatter Louisiana. Christophe never acknowledged it in ink. He never explained. But the truth glared from the image itself. In New Orleans, such a marriage was not merely improper, it was dangerous. Certain bloodlines could not cross without consequences written into law, religion, and violence. What Christophe had done was more than defiance. It was a fracture. Years later, a child would be born of that union. A son raised in Europe, educated, refined, and legally free by every standard recognized beyond American shores. A young man who spoke languages, read philosophy, and understood himself as human in ways slavery could never tolerate. When he returned to Louisiana, he carried papers that said he belonged to no one. Papers that quietly vanished. Somewhere between the river and the city, the law twisted. Names were altered. Records disappeared. And the young man found himself standing beneath chandeliers, surrounded by men who knew exactly what he was and why he terrified them. His beauty was not merely physical, it was symbolic. He was living proof that the system was fragile, that the rules could be broken, that freedom could exist where it was forbidden. The auction was not about ownership, it was about erasure, about controlling a secret before it spread. When the winning family claimed him, they believed they had buried the truth. Instead, they invited it into their home. Within weeks, servants whispered of doors opening on their own, of mirrors reflecting faces that were not there. Illness crept through the household. Finances collapsed without explanation. Death came quietly, then all at once. By the time officials sealed the records, the damage was already done. The young man vanished from history, but his shadow did not. It lingered in bloodlines, in sudden misfortune, in stories told only after midnight. The impossible secret was never that he was beautiful or valuable or desired. It was that he existed at all, a free man sold as property. A truth so dangerous it had to be locked away. And yet, here it is, still breathing, still watching, still waiting to be remembered. What followed would have passed as a quiet family tragedy in Paris, a story barely worth a raised eyebrow. In Louisiana, it was a slow-burning catastrophe. Anatol's reply to his brother crossed the ocean with cold precision. Christophe was erased. Rivier Okan would never open its gates to him again. Money would continue to arrive, but only if Christophe vanished completely from Louisiana's orbit and severed all ties. The marriage would not exist. Any child born of it would not exist. In the ledgers of the Dearu family, Christophe did not live on in exile. He died abroad quietly in the year the letter was written. Christophe's answer took months, as if even the ocean hesitated to deliver it. When it came, it was spare, stripped of protest. He understood. He apologized. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned a son born only weeks earlier, Jean Baptiste. A child who would grow up never knowing he had blood in Louisiana, never knowing an uncle who chose silence over kinship. The letter ended there without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. For more than 2 decades the agreement held. Anatol received nothing from his brother except the sterile assurance of a Parisian bank confirming that Christophe still breathed and still accepted his allowance. Life at Rivier Okan flourished. Anatol married, fathered daughters, expanded his sugar empire, and perfected the art of respectability. When fever claimed his wife, he mourned her properly and buried her beneath marble. He never spoke of Christophe. To the outside world, he had always been an only son. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday in early spring, a letter arrived that did not belong to the routine of ledgers and accounts. It had been forwarded from New York. The handwriting was familiar but weakened, as though the pen itself struggled to stay upright. The message wasted no time on pleasantries, consumption, months at best, the end already visible. Christophe asked for one final mercy. His son was grown now, educated beyond anything Louisiana could offer. Years spent among stone halls and whispered philosophy, fingers trained on piano keys rather than tools, a mind fluent in languages and ancient texts. A young man formed by Europe, not fields. His mother had died years earlier. His father was fading. Soon, Jean Baptiste would be alone, unanchored, with no money and no name that could protect him. Christophe had spent everything chasing a cure that never came. He begged Anatol to take the boy in, not as family, he knew better than to ask that, as something else, a clerk, a secretary, a shadow behind a desk, someone useful, someone hidden. And then, stripped of pride, Christophe admitted the truth. The boy was the only thing he had done right, the only thing worth saving. Anatol read the letter again and again as sunlight crept across the polished floor of his study. His first instinct was rejection. The boy was proof of a forbidden union, flesh and blood, evidence of a line that should never have crossed. In Paris, such details dissolved into sophistication. In Louisiana, they were deadly. To acknowledge Jean Baptiste was to invite whispers, questions, the wrong kind of attention. But Anatol was not guided solely by fear. He was guided by calculation. As he stood there, something darker than charity took shape in his mind. An idea that felt clever rather than cruel, an opportunity disguised as obligation. He sat, dipped his pen, and agreed to receive the boy. Passage to New Orleans, a steamboat upriver. Anatol would decide the rest upon seeing him. The letter was sealed and sent before doubt could interfere. Afterward, Anatol remained alone for a long while, thinking not of brothers or mercy, but of timing, of fate, of how prophet often arrived wearing unfamiliar faces. Jean Baptiste arrived on a day that felt wrong from the start. The heat pressed down like a warning. When the steamboat tied up at Rivier Okan's private landing, Anatol waited with his overseer and a small group of servants who had learned to watch without reacting. The gangplank dropped, and then the young man stepped into view. The air shifted. He was tall, impossibly composed, carrying himself with a grace that made labor seem like a distant rumor. His clothing was modest but tailored, European in cut, untouched by sweat despite the heat. Dark hair framed his face in loose waves, unfashionable by American standards but undeniably deliberate. When he lifted his eyes, they caught the light in a way that made several people forget to breathe. Not brown, not green. Something in between, like polished amber holding fire beneath the surface. His face belonged in oil paintings, symmetry so precise it felt intentional. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips shaped with almost artistic care. His skin was pale, smooth, unmarred by sun or work, carrying a warmth that suggested distant coasts rather than plantations. He could have walked through any American city unquestioned. More than that, he looked refined in a way that unsettled Anatol. More European than European, as if he had been designed. And then the resemblance struck. The echo of Christophe at the same age, resurrected and perfected. The same bones, the same effortless elegance. It was like watching a ghost step ashore. Jean Baptiste smiled politely. He bowed. He spoke with a voice trained to rooms far quieter than this one. And in that moment, Anatol understood something he should have recognized sooner. The danger was not the boy's ancestry. It was his existence. His presence disrupted the fragile illusion that Riviera depended on. From that instant forward, nothing on the plantation felt entirely real. Shadows seemed to linger too long. Eyes followed Jean Baptiste as he walked, not with desire, but with unease. Because everyone sensed it, even if they could not name it. Something that should not have been there had arrived, and it was already too late to send it back. The moment was suspended, taut and heavy, like the air before a storm breaks. Jean Baptiste stepped carefully from the gangplank, carrying nothing but a single leather trunk, worn yet dignified, its scratches and scuffs telling quiet stories of travel and endurance. His dark wool suit was neatly tailored but patched, buttons mismatched, cuffs turned once already, a careful illusion of refinement hiding modest means. His boots gleamed faintly in the afternoon sun, polished but resolute, and every movement suggested a grace born of privilege, not labor. He set the trunk down gently and lifted his eyes to meet Anatol's. For a long heartbeat, neither man moved. Anatol saw not a stranger, but his brother's face mirrored in this young man, haunting and impossible. Jean Baptiste saw the uncle who had exiled his father, a man whose absence had defined his life before he had even drawn breath. Then the young man extended his hand, voice low, smooth, and measured. Monsieur Dearu, I am Jean Baptiste. Thank you for receiving me. I know this must be difficult for you. It is difficult for me as well. Polite, composed, but never subservient, he spoke as though born to command respect, as though circumstance could never diminish the weight of his presence. Anatol's gaze roamed over him, lingering on posture, clothes, the subtle curve of his jaw, searching for the faintest trace of the ancestry that would condemn him under Louisiana law. He found none, not a single marker. The young man could have passed anywhere, among any society, his aristocratic bearing unquestioned. His existence alone was an anomaly, brilliant, polished, dangerous. Follow me, Anatol said finally, his voice measured, deliberately neutral, as though every inflection mattered. Without waiting, he turned toward the main house, and Jean Baptiste followed, calm but alert. Gaines, the overseer, moved silently to lift the trunk, while 3 house servants, light-skinned Creoles who watched more than they spoke, held their distance. One of the women, Marie Claire, would later recount the sight. He walked as though to his own execution, steady, composed, yet aware that fate itself had shifted beneath his feet. They did not go to the grand house. Instead, Anatol led him to a small cabin tucked behind the main buildings, a structure reserved for those trusted enough to avoid the fields but not enough to sleep among masters. The room was simple: a bed, a table, a chair, a wash basin, a small fireplace that promised comfort in winter but offered little relief in the heat of April. Anatol gestured inside, his words clipped, precise. "This will be your quarters. Food and water will be provided. Tomorrow we will discuss your duties. Tonight you speak to no one. You understand?" Jean Baptiste's eyes swept the small space, then returned to his uncle. "I understand," he said quietly. "May I ask a question?" Anatol's answer was final: tomorrow. And just like that, he was left alone. The first knock on the door came hours later. Marie-Claire, carrying a tray with rice, beans, a piece of chicken and bread, offered it without meeting his gaze. "Thank you," he said in French, and her head jerked up, startled. "You speak?" she asked, voice low. "Yes," he replied simply, calm as if it were expected. Then her words sliced the silence. "You are his nephew? Does he know about your mother?" Jean Baptiste's smile carried no humor, only quiet acknowledgement. "Yes, he knows." Marie-Claire studied him, her expression guarded. Then, almost inaudibly, she whispered a warning: "Be careful. Mr. Dear is not cruel, but he is practical. And sometimes practical men do terrible things because they make sense on paper." She left without another word, leaving him with a creeping sense of unease he could not yet name. Alone, he set the tray aside and unpacked his trunk. Every item told a story of survival and preparation: a few changes of clothing, carefully folded, a worn copy of Montaigne's essays, a French Bible, a packet of letters from his father, tied with string, and most crucially, a leather portfolio containing his papers, certificates, and baptismal records. Each document a tether to a life that had almost been erased. Jean Baptiste studied the small cabin, the sunlight slanting across the wooden floorboards, and felt the weight of Louisiana pressing against him. Not its heat, not its labor, but the invisible rules, the delicate lattice of social expectation, and the quiet machinery of power ready to test him. He ate because he was hungry, but each bite reminded him that he had crossed into a place that would never fully recognize him as human. Here, he was already a question to be solved, a problem to be managed, a life to be measured against the convenience and ambition of others. Outside, the air settled into night. Shadows stretched long and thin across the cabin walls, carrying whispers he could almost hear. The plantation had accepted him, but it had not welcomed him. In every creak of the floorboards, in the rustle of moss-laden oaks, he felt the gaze of something waiting, something that would not allow him to move freely without scrutiny. Here, in the quiet of that April evening, Jean Baptiste understood the truth he had glimpsed from the moment he stepped onto the landing. He was both a visitor and a danger, a presence that defied the order of Louisiana, and the plantation, magnificent and oppressive, had already begun to reckon with his arrival. This was not a house that forgave anomalies. It only contained them, catalogued them, and decided whether they would endure. And Jean Baptiste Dearu, with his European grace, his impossible lineage, and his mind sharpened by study and survival, had arrived precisely at the heart of the storm. He placed the leather portfolio on the table, opened it carefully, and let the document spill onto the wood. Every certificate, every letter, every record was a thread in a story no one in Louisiana wanted told. And as he sat there, the dim light casting half of his face into shadow, the first real fear took root, not fear of violence, but fear of erasure, of being absorbed into a world that measured men by convenience rather than truth. Here, in the quiet of the cairn behind Rivier Okan, Jean Baptiste Dearu began to understand the full weight of what it meant to exist where he was never meant to be. The plantation waited, silent and patient, as if it too were holding its breath, and in that waiting, a story began to unfold, one that would ripple through time, shadowing every step he would take, every gaze that would fall upon him, every whispered recognition of the impossible truth he was here, and nothing would ever be the same. Jean Baptiste spread the contents of his leather portfolio across the small table, the dim light of the cabin catching the edges of the papers like fragments of glass. Letters from professors at the Sorbonne, recommendation after recommendation, all in French, all official, all confirming what no one in Louisiana wanted to accept. He was a free man, born free, educated, untouched by the chains that defined so many lives around him. Each certificate, each letter, each stamped and signed proof was a declaration against the world that had exiled him before he could even speak. He stared at them, long and steady, feeling the weight of their certainty. Then, almost unconsciously, he began cataloguing them. Every date, every issuing authority, every precise phrase, written meticulously in tiny, perfect French. He filled 2 pages with a record of his records, a map of his existence should anyone try to erase it. When finished, he tucked the inventory into the spine of his worn Montaigne, invisible unless someone deliberately sought it out. It was precaution, instinct, habit, and unspoken lesson passed down from his father. In this world, the only thing between you and ruin is the right piece of paper. Guard it as you would your soul, because in many ways they are the same. That night, he slept lightly atop the thin blanket, in his cabin, dressed in his traveling clothes, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of a Louisiana evening. Cicadas droned in the dense trees, frogs croaked in hidden pools, the distant voices of field workers rose and fell like a muted chorus, and beneath it all the Mississippi murmured in the darkness, ever present, whispering secrets just out of comprehension, like a conversation with something ancient, something patient, and infinitely knowing. Morning came with the weight of inevitability. Anatol summoned him to the study at 8, the air heavy with anticipation. The room was a cathedral of power, floor-to-ceiling shelves stacked, with ledgers, a massive desk of polished Louisiana cypress, window framing the endless sugar fields, and portraits of Dearu ancestors staring from the walls as though judging every movement. Jean Baptiste stood before the desk while Anatol remained seated, the unspoken hierarchy pressing down, palpable and suffocating. "You have your papers?" Anatol asked, French crisp and deliberate. "Yes, monsieur," Jean Baptiste replied, tension threading his voice. He understood what was required. His father's final instructions had made him wary, yet he had no choice. Alone in a foreign land, with no allies and a face that could pass for white in a society that measured freedom by the color of blood, he had nowhere else to turn. He placed the portfolio before Anatol, who examined each document with meticulous care, occasionally noting something in his small leather notebook. 20 minutes passed in silence, the only sound the faint scratch of pen against paper. When he finished, Anatol locked the portfolio in his desk drawer. "These appear genuine," he said, measured. "I will hold them for safekeeping. Now we must speak of your circumstances." His words came slowly, each one deliberate, weighted with both authority and warning. "You are my brother's son. I promised him provision. Yet you must understand the difficulty your presence creates. Your mother was colored. Under Louisiana law, that makes you colored. Your appearance may deceive the eye, but the law does not lie. To acknowledge you as my nephew would disrupt marriages, alliances, reputation. My daughters are wed to prominent families. My position in this community relies on careful relationships, and acknowledgement would shatter all of it." Jean Baptiste said nothing. His hands, clasped behind his back, tightened until his knuckles whitened. He felt the first tremor of dread, the subtle twist of reality bending around him. Anatol continued, voice measured, almost clinical. "I am not without compassion. You will have shelter, sustenance, and work here at Rivier Okan. You will serve as my secretary. You will handle correspondence, particularly with French merchants. You will maintain records. You will live in the cabin you occupied last night. In exchange, you will speak of nothing your father, your time in Paris, your documents. As far as the world is concerned, you are Jean Baptiste, a light-skinned slave I purchased privately. Do you understand?" The word slave hung in the air, dense and suffocating. Jean Baptiste felt something inside bend under the pressure, not break, but twist in ways that made the ground beneath him tremble. "I understand," he said cautiously. "You are asking me to pretend I am enslaved, despite the proof of my freedom." Anatol's eyes were steady, unyielding. "You are being practical. You are in Louisiana, not Paris. French certificates carry little weight here. Without my protection, you would be vulnerable, questioned, detained, perhaps claimed by someone less scrupulous. Free people of color have been enslaved for less. I am offering safety. You will live as if enslaved, though you are not." It is a performance uncomfortable but necessary. In time, arrangements may allow other paths. Perhaps settlement in the north, perhaps return to France once my daughters are settled. Jean Baptiste absorbed the weight of those words in silence, the reality of his situation settling like a cold fog over the room. He was a free man, yet bound to act as property. He was educated, accomplished, brilliant, and now a pawn in a system that had no regard for truth. Every document, every proof of his existence was locked away unseen. His freedom became invisible, a secret kept beneath the veneer of obedience. The study, the portraits, the silent scrutiny of the plantation pressed upon him like the walls of a tomb. The task before him was clear: survive by becoming what he was not, conceal what he was, and navigate the labyrinth of a society that could destroy him at the merest hint of disobedience. Here the rules of reality were rewritten, and the cost of being seen for what he truly was could be death. Jean Baptiste understood, and in that understanding the nightmarish truth settled over him. Rivier Okan had accepted him, but it had not welcomed him. Every step he took, every glance he offered would be measured, recorded, and interpreted. Every whisper, every shadow, every murmur of the river beyond would speak against him if he faltered. And yet he would endure, for now he had papers, wit, and an intellect the plantation could not crush. And though he would wear the mask of a slave, the fire of his freedom, hidden and smoldering, would remain untouchable. The plantation waited. The Mississippi whispered. Jean Baptiste Dearu, a free man bound in chains of circumstance, began the impossible task of surviving the very place designed to erase him. The offer hung in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of the study. Anatol's words were careful, deliberate, practical, but Jean Baptiste felt the weight of them pressing on his chest, heavy and suffocating. Protection, safety, shelter. Yet beneath those words was something darker, something unspoken but unmistakable: erasure. Anatol wasn't simply providing sanctuary. He was transforming a problem into utility, a nephew into an asset, a life into a ledger entry. He was making the inconvenient vanish not through violence but through the law, through social decree, through the terrifying machinery of the plantation itself. Jean Baptiste studied his uncle, eyes narrowing just slightly, understanding more than Anatol imagined. This wasn't benevolence, it was strategy. It was cold, precise, and terrifying, and when he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, it carried that understanding. And if I refuse, then came the quiet finality, the absolute certainty in Anatol's tone, then I cannot help you. You will receive your papers and enough money to reach New Orleans, and after that you are on your own. You have no family here, no connections, no resources. You speak little English, and your appearance will draw attention, questions you cannot answer. Where will you go? What will you do? The words were not cruel, but they were final. Both knew the answer. There was nowhere safe in Louisiana for a young man whose skin could deceive the eye but whose blood betrayed him. Free papers, European proof meant nothing here. They could save a life or end it. The law and custom were sharp, indiscriminate blades, and those who strayed from the categories this land demanded were quickly caught and broken. Jean Baptiste felt the truth sink into his bones. Survival would demand compromise. I understand, he said at last, the syllables tasting of ash and bitter resolve. When do I begin? Today, Anatol replied, opening a fresh page in a ledger. His pen moved smoothly, deliberately, recording a reality Jean Baptiste had known intellectually but had not yet felt viscerally. We must first establish your status officially, he said aloud, the ink scratching like a whisper of inevitability across the page. Acquired, April 3, 1852. One male, age 23, name, Jean Baptiste. Light-skinned, educated, suitable for domestic work. Private sale, no bill of sale available. Value $2,000. He looked up at the young man. Now, you exist in my records, your presence is explained. Your father's allowance continues until his death. You will work as my secretary. You will be fed, sheltered, and protected. This, I believe, is the best arrangement we can hope for under these circumstances. Jean Baptiste felt the subtle, almost imperceptible shift inside him, a bending, a warping, a quiet fracture. He had understood this in theory, but seeing it enacted, watching Anatol transform him, with nothing but pen and paper. From a free man into property was a visceral, almost physical revelation. The locked drawer that held his proofs of freedom suddenly seemed meaningless. The ledger on the desk, the ink drying like blood, was authority itself. He swallowed hard. "May I ask one question, monsieur?" "Of course," came the calm reply. "Did you ever intend to help me, or was this the plan from the moment you received my father's letter?" Anatol paused, the faintest flicker of something, regret maybe, or the shifting of light across the desk crossing his features. "I intended to be practical for both of us," he finally said, his voice as smooth and certain as the ink in the ledger. "Now let me show you where you will work." The following weeks passed with an eerie rhythm, each day a rehearsal of obedience and observation. Jean Baptiste served as Anatol's secretary in a small office adjacent to the main study, handling letters from French merchants, translating business documents, maintaining records that few in Louisiana could read, advising on investments, evaluating contracts, even interpreting European political developments for their impact on the plantation's fortunes. He performed every task with precision, intelligence, and grace, never overstepping, yet revealing his brilliance in every careful answer. The others on the plantation did not know how to categorize him. He was too white to be enslaved, yet he lived as one. He spoke French, yet his labor was domestic. Educated, yet confined, he existed in a space that made everyone around him uneasy, uncertain. Some of the house servants, Marie Claire, Thomas the stable hand, Wenai, who ran the kitchen, offered small kindnesses, sharing food or passing quiet warnings, teaching him the unwritten rules of life under Rivier Okan. Others avoided him, suspicion etched into their faces, wary of someone who seemed to straddle worlds no one was supposed to inhabit. Even as he learned the rhythms of the plantation, Jean Baptiste remained vigilant, careful. He accepted kindness but never assumed safety. He kept his evenings for his books, the few treasures he had carried from Paris, Montaigne, his Bible, letters from his father, the leather portfolio that held the fragile proof of a freedom no one here could recognize. Every day was a lesson in performance, a delicate negotiation of appearance and reality, truth and deception. Jean Baptiste had entered a place designed to erase him, and yet he persisted, every step a quiet rebellion, every observation a survival strategy. The plantation waited, its vast fields and shadowed corridors silently assessing him, the Mississippi murmuring beyond the banks, unseen but always listening. Here, in the tension between power and vulnerability, intelligence and survival, Jean Baptiste Dearu began to master the impossible, living as a free man while pretending to be bound, keeping his soul intact beneath the smoke and shadows of a world that would have denied it. And in that mastery, in that quiet, tense endurance, the plantation learned something new. He was not so easily erased. The ledger recorded him, the shadows watched him, and the river whispered, carrying the story forward as Jean Baptiste, caught between freedom and performance, stepped into a reality designed to consume him and survived. The letters he wrote to his father were like whispers cast into a void. He knew, deep down, that the man in New York was probably gone, but still he wrote. Careful in French, measured in tone, polite yet full of invisible sorrow. "I am well. I am safe. I work as a secretary. Uncle Anatol has been generous in his own way. I think of you always." He never sent these letters. They were folded and tucked into his trunk, prayers kept private, their existence enough to ease his restless mind. Anatol, for all his meticulous planning, had underestimated a single, impossible variable, the effect of Jean Baptiste's presence outside the plantation. In his mind, the young man's extraordinary beauty, his refinement, his knowledge of languages, all of it would remain contained, a quiet advantage within the walls of Rivier Okan. He had not imagined the reaction that awaited once they entered New Orleans. It was May, the 7th day of the month, a Wednesday, when Anatol decided to take Jean Baptiste with him. Business demanded his attention, sugar contracts to finalize, deals with partners to secure. And Jean Baptiste, with his Sorbonne education and subtle elegance, could serve as witness, translator, and proof of Anatol's own sophistication. They traveled by steamboat, arriving at the docks as the morning sun hit the glinting water. New Orleans sprawled before them, chaotic, vibrant, intoxicating. The levee buzzed with merchants, sailors, free people of color, conmen, tourists, every figure moving in the intricate, contradictory rhythm of the city. Jean Baptiste followed silently, a shadow at Anatol's side. At the club, at private homes, during discussions of prices and shipping, he translated, recorded, observed. Yet everywhere he went, eyes followed him. It was never rude, never hostile, just a silent, collective pause. Women brushed past him, captivated. Men examined him with the careful scrutiny usually reserved for thoroughbreds or rare works of art. Conversations stuttered when he entered, not for anything he had done, but because his presence alone demanded attention. By the third engagement, at the home of a commission merchant, the air itself seemed to thicken. Madame Leroux approached Anatol, her gaze sharp, incisive. "Monsieur Dearu," she said in French, "you will forgive my curiosity, but that young man, he is your property?" Anatol, anticipating the question, nodded, calm, deliberate. "A recent acquisition," he replied. "He serves as my secretary." Remarkable. In every way, her eyes studied Jean Baptiste, measuring, appraising. "I have never seen a slave like him," she said bluntly. "Where did you acquire him?" Anatol's answer was vague, rehearsed. "A private sale from an estate in Baton Rouge." Another woman, Madame Ellen Furia, known for her luxurious household of light-skinned servants, pressed the question further. "Would you consider offers? I would pay handsomely for someone of his qualities." Anatol demurred, insisting the young man was too useful, yet the seed had been planted. Back at Rivier Okan that evening, Anatol could not shake the thought. How much could Jean Baptiste be worth, not merely for his skills, which were considerable, but for the allure of him, the elegance, beauty, the undeniable aura of privilege that made every gaze linger, every conversation falter. His education, his demeanor, his lineage, all of it combined to make him extraordinary, dangerous, unforgettable. That night, Jean Baptiste returned to his cairn, unaware of the calculations being made in the study above. Anatol sat with ledgers and ink, numbers dancing in his mind. He had recorded the young man's value at $2,000, already a high sum for a domestic servant. But the day's reaction suggested he could command far more, 3,000, perhaps 4. And the more Anatol considered it, the more it seemed inevitable. Jean Baptiste's very existence at Rivier Okan was no longer an asset but a liability. Too distinctive, too arresting, too memorable. Sooner or later, someone would ask the wrong question, make the wrong connection, notice the faintest resemblance to Christophe, to the Dearu family, to the plantation itself. Better to sell him publicly, Anatol reasoned. In New Orleans, at the St. Louis Hotel, where auctions were precise, prestigious, unavoidable, Jean Baptiste could be valued openly, legally, unmistakably. He would disappear into another household, extraordinary but untraceable, his presence safe, for Anatol's reputation, his power intact. The arrangements began immediately. Jean Baptiste learned of them quietly, on a Sunday afternoon, a book in hand, the words of Montaigne before his eyes. Anatol arrived, accompanied by Gaines and one of the housemen. Jean Baptiste's instincts, honed from years of cautious observation, registered the significance instantly. 3 men, not casual, not a routine visit. Change was coming, and with it, the first shadow of a future he could neither avoid nor control. From that day forward, the plantation itself seemed to hold its breath. Jean Baptiste's life, already a careful performance of survival, was about to enter a theater of commerce, desire, and peril. His beauty, intellect, and lineage, all the traits that had kept him alive, were now currency. And every shadow, every glance, every whispered calculation promised a single, chilling truth. He was more than a man. He was an event, an impossibility walking into the world, and the world was about to respond. The ledger awaited him. The Mississippi whispered outside, and Jean Baptiste, a free man masked as property, prepared to step into the glare of a reality designed to consume him. The city, the auction, the eyes of the powerful, all were waiting. And for the first time he understood the true weight of survival, that to endure here he would need to become both invisible and unforgettable all at once. And so the story of Jean Baptiste Dearu moved forward, a tale of beauty, danger, and impossible circumstance, carried by whispers of silk, the clatter of ledgers, and the quiet, inexorable judgment of a society that measured men by their worth and punished those who defied its rules. I have decided to sell you." Anatol's words landed without warning, cold and precise, cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin like a knife. The syllables themselves carried the weight of inevitability, the absolute finality of a man who had already decided your fate. Jean Baptiste felt the leather-bound book slip from his hands, thudding softly against the floor, but even the sound seemed distant, muffled, as though the world had narrowed to the three figures in the room and the sentence that had reshaped everything. Anatol did not hesitate, did not offer comfort or apology. There was no room for negotiation, no whisper of sentiment. "There is an auction at the St. Louis Hotel. You will be presented there," he said, his voice steady, commanding, utterly devoid of hesitation. The words rolled off his tongue in French, crisp, unyielding, and Jean Baptiste felt the chill of the city's law and custom descend upon him even in the remote quiet of the plantation. "You gave me your word that this was temporary," Jean Baptiste whispered, voice barely more than breath, trembling with the collision of shock and fury. "You promised you would help me leave Louisiana eventually." "And I will," Anatol replied smoothly, almost serenely, his words the kind that could convince or wound in equal measure. "By selling you to a good family in New Orleans. You will be better there, indoors, with work suited to your education, with access to society, to refinement. In many ways it is an improvement. I am not a slave to be sold." Jean Baptiste's voice broke under the weight of disbelief, anger, and helplessness. "I am your brother's son. I have papers proving my freedom." "You forget," Anatol said, eyes narrowing slightly, "that your situation is more complicated than a mere question of documents. Your mother's status affects you. Louisiana law is explicit in these matters. Your French papers mean little here. My mother was free, legally married in Paris. I was born free." The words came faster now, rising, fueled by incredulity. "The documents prove it." "Your mother was colored," Anatol said flatly. "In this place, that defines you, no matter what Paris says, no matter what the law there states. Without American papers proving her status, your freedom is precarious. I am protecting you by maintaining the fiction that you are my property. Otherwise, you could be claimed by anyone who challenged your status. At least in this way, you belong to someone respectable." Jean Baptiste understood instantly the twisted logic, the monstrous calculus. The law was a cage, and Anatol held the key, his respectability outweighing the truth, his position making the lie absolute. The reality was unthinkable, suffocating a free man, defined as property, trapped by geography, appearance, and power. "Please," he murmured, barely above a whisper, voice tasting of ashes and despair, "please don't do this. My father trusted you. He asked you to protect me." "And I am," Anatol said, his voice calm, immovable, utterly final. "You will cooperate, or I will have you restrained and brought by force. The choice is yours." Jean Baptiste looked at the men standing behind Anatol, at Gaines and the two other house servants, silent and watchful. He understood in a single, terrible instant that resistance was impossible. One against the machinery of the plantation was not a struggle, it was a sentence. Escape was a fantasy. Flight impossible. The rivers, the swamps, the marshes, they were traps, and the overseers, armed and vigilant, were predators. "I will cooperate," he said finally, each word like iron in his mouth. "Good," Anatol replied. "We leave for New Orleans soon. Prepare yourself. This sale will define your future. Present yourself well." The cabin door clicked shut behind him, the key turning with a finality that made his stomach twist. Alone, Jean Baptiste sat on the edge of the thin bed, trembling not from fear exact, but from a mingled rage and helplessness, so deep it clawed at him from the inside. There was nothing to strike, no walls to pound, no voice that could carry his protest. He was trapped in the stillness, the silence, the inevitability of it all. He did the only thing he could, he wrote. For hours, he documented every detail, every violation of trust, every moment of deception. His arrival, the polite subterfuge of his reception, the confiscation of his papers, the ledger entry. That made him property, the trip to New Orleans, Anatol's calm, terrifying decision to sell him. Every word precise, legalistic, impossible to misinterpret. Each line a scream into a void that might never hear it. He addressed the letters carefully, meticulously to the French consulate in New Orleans, Perhaps they would intervene. Perhaps they would see him as a man, not a commodity. Perhaps they would care. He folded them with care, slid them into the hidden spine of his Montaigne, the same place he had stashed the inventory of his documents, the record of his life, his freedom, his identity. That night, he lay on the bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, listening to the whispers of the plantation. The wind tangled in the trees, the distant chorus of field workers, the endless murmur of the Mississippi as it crept along the horizon, relentless, indifferent, eternal. And beneath it all, a pulse of inevitability. He was to be sold, marked, redefined. His father, probably dead, had trusted Anatol, and now that trust would be repaid in betrayal disguised as protection. The next morning the cabin door opened. Gain entered, bringing food and instructions. He could move about the plantation, but the boundaries were absolute. The sugar fields stretched like gold under the sun, the quarters alive with whispers, and work, the main house looming. A citadel of authority and calculation. Every building, every path, every shadow was mapped in Jean Baptiste's mind, memorized, a silent preparation for what was to come. The auction loomed. Every detail, every measurement, every human observation would matter. Every glance, every hesitation could mark him, claim him. The city of New Orleans awaited, vibrant and corrupt, a stage of commerce, desire, and human cruelty. And Jean Baptiste, free in spirit, but bound in circumstance, would have to navigate it all, a man transformed into property, a life measured in dollars, yet unwilling to surrender the fire within. And so, the story of Jean Baptiste Dearu pressed forward, carried on whispers, on the quiet clatter of ledges, on the ever-present river, a story of beauty, danger, and impossible circumstance, where the laws of man collided with the truth of life, and the world prepared to see if a single free soul could endure in a place built to erase him. The shadows watched, the river whispered, and in the space between freedom and survival, Jean Baptiste Dearu began the most impossible performance of his life, one that would echo through time, long after the gavel fell. The Mississippi flowed past, eternal and indifferent, carrying the world's indifference in its current. On the 12th of May, Thomas found Jean Baptiste lingering near the stables, his posture tense, his gaze distant, almost lost in the whisper of the river. Thomas approached cautiously, his voice low, careful, speaking in French. "I heard what's happening. I'm sorry." Jean Baptiste regarded him quietly, recognizing the rare kindness in a world that had offered him little. "Will you do something for me?" he asked, words barely above a breath. "If I can," Thomas answered. Jean Baptiste reached into his cabin and pulled out the folded letter, pressing it into Thomas's hand with a gravity that made the paper feel like it bore the weight of his very existence. After the auction, he said, "Not before. Take this to the French consulate on Chartres Street. Tell them it's urgent. Can you do that?" Thomas studied the letter, then looked at Jean Baptiste, the lines of exhaustion and quiet despair etched into his face. "You think it will help?" "I don't know," Jean Baptiste admitted, the words tasting bitter. "Probably not. But I have to try. I have to leave a record, some proof that I was here, that I existed as more than property." Thomas nodded, tucking the letter inside his shirt. "I'll do it. Day after the auction." "Why?" Jean Baptiste asked, his voice soft, curious, desperate for understanding. Thomas smiled, a sad, knowing curve of his lips, the kind of smile that carried recognition of the impossible. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "doing the right thing is all we've got, even when it changes nothing." On the 13th, Anatol, Gaines, and Jean Baptiste departed for New Orleans by steamboat, the river curling behind them like a witness to their passage. Evening fell as they arrived at the St. Louis Hotel, imposing and grand, the heart of commerce and society in the city. Jean Baptiste was not lodged among guests, but confined to a secure room on the ground floor, its windows barred, its bed narrow, its walls sterile and unyielding, and comfortable, yet unmistakably a cell. That night, sleep eluded him. He perched on the edge of the bed, tracing the chain of choices, betrayals, and misfortune that had carried him from freedom in Paris to this cage in New Orleans. His thoughts wandered to his mother, claimed by cholera years before, who had loved his father with reckless courage, living alone in Paris until their marriage, and never regretting it despite exile and loss. He thought of his father, dying or dead in New York, who had trusted Anatol to protect his son. And now Anatol had transformed that trust into trade, into calculation, into merchandise. Rage and despair wrestled in his chest. Yet, in the dark, a decision crystallized. If he was to be sold, he would not go silently. The morning of May 14th dawned oppressive, already heavy with heat. By 9, the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel swelled with buyers, onlookers, curiosity, and appetite coiled into a dense, impatient hum. The marble auction block, scarred with centuries of sales, jewelry, furniture, human lives, gleamed under the rising sun, awaiting its next display. Anatol arrived early with Gaines and Jean Baptiste. The young man was dressed for the occasion. White linen shirt emphasizing his pale skin, dark trousers suggesting elegance, boots polished, hair brushed back, no ornament to distract from the spectacle that was him. When they entered, the reaction was immediate. Conversation stuttered to silence. Eyes turned, sharp and assessing. Women lingered where they could watch. Men measured him with appraising gazes usually reserved for prized horses or rare furniture. Even Perrault, the professional auctioneer accustomed to conducting thousands of sales, paused, his practiced composure rattled by the singular figure before him. Word had spread today something extraordinary would be offered. Advertisements Anatol had placed, deliberately vague yet enticing, had whispered of rarity, male domestic servant, exceptional qualities, educated, multilingual, suitable for the most refined household. Those who read between the lines came ready to spend, to acquire not just labor but spectacle, to own a human jewel. At 10:30, the auction began. Perrault ascended the podium, surveying the crowd, voice clear in English, then repeated in French. "Ladies and gentlemen, we present today the property of Monsieur Anatol Dearu of Rivier Okan Plantation. This young man represents the finest example of domestic capacity available in our market." Jean Baptiste was led forward by Gaines, stepping with careful precision, every movement disciplined, controlled. He reached the center of the marble platform and halted. Hands at his sides, gaze fixed to the middle distance. In the sunlight spilling through the dome, he seemed to glow, luminous, ethereal. His amber eyes caught the light, aristocratic features carved by something beyond ordinary design. The effect on the room was electric. He did not look like someone who could be sold. He looked like a man, but standing here, he had become more a symbol, a disruption, a challenge to every categorization the world relied on. White, yet enslaved. Educated, yet displayed as property. Wealthy in bearing, yet standing on the auction block. The room held its breath. Perrault began the description, voice now steady, professional, though even he could not disguise a hint of awe. Age 23, fluent in French, domestic servant of unparalleled skill. Attentive, disciplined, educated, suitable only for the finest household. Each word a layer of veneer over the tragic reality. Each syllable a reminder of the gulf between who Jean Baptiste was and who he had been made to appear. And all the while the shadows of the rotunda seemed to watch, the city beyond whispered with river-borne secrets, and in the space between freedom and survival, Jean Baptiste Dearu began a performance more impossible than any stage could hold. A performance where every glance, every judgment, every hushed exclamation counted, and yet, despite the weight of the world pressing upon him, he held himself upright, unbroken in spirit, even as the gavel loomed, ready to seal his fate. The story of a free man rendered property continued, a tale carried in whispers, in ledger entries, in the gleam of sunlight on marble, and in that breathless, suspended moment, Jean Baptiste Dearu became more than a man, more than property, a ghostly testament to survival, dignity, and the quiet, relentless insistence of the human spirit. The rotunda trembled with anticipation, every polished marble surface reflecting the sun in blinding flashes. The auctioneer's voice carried smoothly at first, reciting the attributes of the young man before them. Fluent in French, Italian, and Latin, experienced in secretarial work, correspondence, and bookkeeping, of gentle temperament, suitable for the most refined household, certified in health. A domestic servant of singular quality, a jewel among property. The bidding began like a ripple across still water, cautious hands rising, the first calls tentative, then urgent. 2,000, then 2,200. The numbers climbed, each increment drawing murmurs from the crowd, each rise feeding the growing energy, until reason itself seemed to shiver beneath the heat and expectation of the room. 3,000, 3,500. A woman's voice, sharp, precise, cutting through the murmurs. Madame Ellen Furia, her gaze fixed on Jean Baptiste as though he were an object she had already claimed in imagination. 4,000, 5,000. The atmosphere grew electric. This was no longer a simple sale. It had become a spectacle, a theater of status, desire, and vanity. To possess Jean Baptiste was to possess not merely labor, but prestige, a symbol, a marvel to display, a jewel that elevated its owner merely by proximity. Anatol watched, calculating, heart-stirring with the satisfaction of a man who had long suspected the truth that Jean Baptiste was extraordinary, far beyond the ordinary value of any servant, and that today would mark the most remarkable transaction the city had witnessed. 5,500, 6,000. The bids rose, and with each rise, the crowd leaned closer, entranced by the unfolding spectacle, hungering for the drama as much as the acquisition. At 7,000 only two remained, Madame Furia and Monsieur Laria. Each bid became a declaration, each increase a challenge, each glance between them loaded with rivalry and unspoken pride. 7,500, 8,500, 9,000. A hush settled over the rotunda. No one dared breathe too loud. The auction had passed the threshold of commerce and entered something more primal, obsession. Jean Baptiste stood at the center of it all, perfectly composed, face serene, eyes amber and alert. Inside him, a different calculation unfolded, one of courage and timing. Fear had been replaced by a cold, crystalline determination. He had chosen his moment the night before, rehearsed it in the dark, and now he waited for it to arrive. At 10,000, Madame Furia hesitated. The sum was staggering, more than many earned in years, a fortune compressed into a single transaction. Pero, sensing the uncertainty, turned toward Laria. The question hung in the air. Would he bid further? 10,500, Laria called, and the room held its breath. Pero turned to Furia, expectant, his gavel suspended, ready to fall. Then, calm, unmistakable, Jean Baptiste spoke, his words slicing through the thick air of anticipation. Je suis libre, I am free. Silence fell like a physical weight, pressing against every shoulder, stilling every voice. A few gasps escaped. Confusion rippled through the audience. Had they heard correctly? Anatol's face drained of color, then flared crimson in fury. Gaines moved, ready to intervene, but Pero raised his hand, uncertain, caught between law, tradition, and spectacle. Jean Baptiste continued, voice now steady, clear, echoing under the soaring dome. My name is Jean Baptiste Dearu. I am the son of Christophe Dearu, nephew of Anatol Dearu. Born free in Paris, France, on March 12, 1829. I am a French citizen with complete documentation of my birth and free status. Upon arrival in Louisiana, my uncle confiscated my papers and falsely entered me in plantation records as a slave. Under French and Louisiana law, I cannot be enslaved. This sale is fraudulent. Everyone here, including the auctioneer and bidders, is participating in an illegal act. The rotunda seemed to hold its breath. Time paused, the echoes of his voice reverberating off marble, settling in the crowd like a heavy, unavoidable truth. Then chaos erupted. Anatol lunged toward the platform, shouting in French, calling Jean Baptiste delusional, claiming he was the son of a slave educated as a curiosity. Pero stepped back, uncertainty overtaking decades of practiced authority. Men in the audience argued violently, some insisting the auction be stopped pending investigation, others shouting that a slave's word carried no weight. Madame Furia, pale as wax, conferred urgently with a lawyer, her hands trembling, eyes wide, searching for leverage. Laria demanded documentation, frantic for clarity, desperate to regain control. In the midst of the storm, a tall, thin man in the uniform of the French consulate emerged from the crowd, pushing forward. He introduced himself as François Mercier, assistant to the consulate, and handed a folded document to Pero, his accent sharp, precise, the weight of law and legitimacy accompanying him. And in that suspended, impossible moment, Jean Baptiste stood unmoving, radiant and resolute. The shadows seemed to bend toward him. The rotunda held its collective breath, and for the first time the world, at least this small, crowded, gilded corner of it, was forced to reckon not with property, not with spectacle, but with a man asserting his freedom, with a life that refused erasure. The river outside carried its endless song past the city, indifferent yet eternal. Inside, history was being written in real time, a story of power, law, and courage intersecting on the marble block. Jean Baptiste Dearu, the free man forced into the guise of property, had become more than flesh or title. He had become a testament, a spectral witness, a living proof that the human spirit cannot be bound by ledger, gavel, or the laws of men. And as the crowd trembled, shouting and arguing around him, the words he had prepared and carried through fire and fear hung in the air, luminous and undeniable. "I am free." The murmurs in the rotunda had barely faded when a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and absolute, slicing through the fevered energy like a knife through silk, cut through the noise. "The French consulate has received documentation regarding Monsieur Jean Baptiste Dearu." The words echoed under the soaring dome, carrying the weight of authority, of law, of something far larger than the spectacle surrounding them. The paper Mercier held trembled slightly in his hand, but the force of its contents was undeniable. Birth registration in Paris, 1829. Baptism at Église Saint-Pé. Full recognition as a French citizen. Parents listed as Christophe Dearu, French citizen, and Céleste Moreau, free woman of color, resident of Paris. Under French law, Jean Baptiste could not be enslaved. The consulate demanded, formally, that the sale be suspended immediately pending thorough legal review. The effect was instantaneous. Perrault's practiced composure faltered. He looked first at the document, then at Anatol, then at Jean Baptiste, the calculus of liability flashing in his eyes. If the young man were indeed free, every man in the room involved in this transaction could face consequences, financial, legal, even criminal. But if he were not, and the sale halted prematurely, those who had bid, those who had organized, could demand recompense, an impossible tangle of truth and law. Anatol, recovering from the shock, snapped, producing papers from the deep pocket of his jacket. "Jean Baptiste's confiscated documents. These are forgeries," he shouted, his voice taut with rage. "He is the son of a slave at my plantation, a woman named Céleste, who died in 1848. He has been fed lies about his parentage, led to believe himself something he is not. I intended only to place him with a good family in New Orleans, where he might be corrected of his delusion. This interruption is a deliberate fraud." Jean Baptiste's stomach churned. Every detail, the timing, the claim, the manipulation had been anticipated. Anatol had crafted a counter-narrative, a shadow to his nephew's truth, anchored by a conveniently deceased slave, a mother whose identity could not easily be verified. Who could contest Anatol's version? Who could unravel this carefully constructed fiction? And yet Mercier, calm and unwavering, produced another paper. "We also have a letter," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed rotunda, precise, deliberate. A letter written by Jean Baptiste himself, delivered that very morning. It recounted his journey to Louisiana, the confiscation of his papers, the fraudulent claim of enslavement. It demonstrated knowledge of French law, literature, and society consistent with his education and upbringing. Copies had been forwarded to the Louisiana Attorney General and federal authorities. An official investigation had already begun. Anatol went still, a letter, written, dispatched, and verified by external authority. Even if he had legal maneuvering, even if he had documents to claim ownership, now the machinery of the law and foreign jurisdiction bore down upon him. Any attempt to proceed would expose him to scrutiny that could destroy not only his plans but his reputation and entire business empire. Pero the auctioneer struck the gavel twice, sharp cracks that echoed like gunshots, slicing through murmurs, confusion, and the heavy tension. "This auction is suspended pending legal review. The property," he paused, as though even calling the boy property might be a misstep. The individual in question will be removed from the block and held in secure custody until resolution. All bids are void. This sale will not proceed today. Gaines moved, perhaps instinctively, toward Jean Baptiste, but Mercier's hand stopped him. The young man would be taken into city authority, not back into Anatol's control. Conflict of interest prevented otherwise. Two constables stepped forward, silent and deliberate, guiding Jean Baptiste away from the marble platform, but not shackling him. Not yet. They treated him as potentially free, and in that recognition the first breath of justice entered the room. As he passed Anatol, their eyes met. Rage, disbelief, and perhaps just a flicker of it respect swirled across his uncle's face. Jean Baptiste said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Every declaration, every truth, every proof had already been laid bare beneath the dome for hundreds to witness. He was escorted to the Cabildo, a building that housed city government offices and jail cells. The room assigned to him was neither cell nor guest chamber, a strange liminal space, reflecting his ambiguous status. A bed, a chair, a small table, a barred window. Locked in, yes, but unshackled. Guarded, but not treated as a criminal. 3 days passed in this strange in-between. Lawyers examined documents, officials took testimony, unraveling the complex web of deceit and law that Anatol had constructed. During this time, several truths were confirmed, each one a hammer striking the iron of the past. Christophe Dear was dead, having passed in New York just 12 days before the auction, his final days shadowed by hope that Anatol would protect his son. Jean Baptiste would never know if that hope was trust or desperate faith. The French consulate verified every document: birth, baptism, parentage, free status, all authentic. Anatol's witnesses attested only to a slave named Celeste who had died in 1848, claiming that her son was Jean Baptiste, a version of the truth twisted for convenience. The testimonies, however well-intentioned or coerced, could not overturn the weight of verified birth and citizenship records. In that time, Jean Baptiste understood the magnitude of what had occurred. He had stood upon the marble platform, his humanity threatened, stripped by law and custom, and yet had claimed it back before hundreds of witnesses. He had transformed fear into defiance, vulnerability into power, paper and speech into survival. The rotunda, the crowd, Anatol's fury all faded into background against the clarity of justice creeping forward, uneven, slow but inexorable, and so he remained neither prisoner nor fully free, but a living testament. The ledger, the gavel, the auction block, all had failed to erase him. Jean Baptiste Dio had asserted his existence in a world determined to commodify him, and in that declaration he became more than a man. He became a symbol, a ghostly witness to the human spirit's refusal to be owned. And as he waited for the authorities to complete their work, every shadow on the wall, every whispered conversation carried his story forward. He had survived the spectacle, and his survival would echo far beyond the marble, the crowd, and the law itself. The air in the courtroom was thick with the dust of paper and whispered speculation, a weight pressing on every shoulder. Inside the records room, the documents lay stacked like fragile sentinels, each one a small beacon of truth in a world built to obscure it. Witnesses spoke, their voices carrying a strange authority precisely because of the absurdity of their position. Enslaved people testifying about what they had seen, their words treated as evidence against the machinery of ownership and power. The law twisted and turned around them, strange and archaic, demanding clarity from shadows. The question that haunted the proceedings was impossibly complex. Two women named Celeste, one in Paris, one at Rivier Okan, cast a spectral line across the years. Were they the same? Was the Parisian Celeste enslaved before Jean Baptiste's birth or after? Under the cruel logic of Louisiana law, under the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, if she had been enslaved before he was born, her child's freedom was a lie, irrelevant to the ledger or the gavel. But if she had been free, or if she was a different woman entirely, then Jean Baptiste had never belonged to anyone at all. No one could prove it either way. Every statement, every paper, every signature was caught between truth and shadow, each leaning in a different direction, none decisive. On May 17th, Judge Thibault, a man of careful thought and subtle sympathy for people of color, rendered a ruling that was at once decisive and entirely ambiguous, a masterpiece of legal liminality. He declared that Jean Baptiste's legal status could not be determined conclusively from the evidence at hand. The papers indicated freedom. The testimony suggested enslavement. Without Celeste herself alive to clarify or additional proof, no certainty could be achieved. Therefore, the attempted sale was null and void. Anatol could claim no authority over Jean Baptiste, could hold him as no one's property, yet neither could Jean Baptiste immediately claim all the full rights of a free man. He existed in a liminal space, suspended between two worlds, tethered to neither, visible and invisible at once. The practical outcome was striking. Jean Baptiste was released from formal custody, but barred from leaving Louisiana without permission. Anatol was stripped of the power he had so carefully constructed over his nephew. The auction was officially cancelled, the bidder's money returned. Yet the law offered no celebratory clarity, no sharp line between slavery and freedom, only the uneasy twilight of technical liberation. Jean Baptiste had survived, yes, but on terms that remained opaque to him and everyone else. When he stepped out of the cabildo that afternoon, the sunlight hit him in waves, harsh and indifferent. In his hands were only the belongings he had brought to New Orleans, his leather trunk, his clothes, and inside that trunk, the papers that proved him, Judge Thibault's ruling, his birth certificate, letters from the French consulate confirming his citizenship and promising assistance should it be needed. $8 from Anatol, handed over without ceremony or acknowledgement. He knew no one in the city, had no home, no certainty. And yet, for all the terror in that moment, there was exhilaration. He was alive. He was in some form free. What came next slips into the realm where history and myth blur. Some accounts suggest he vanished immediately, a ghost walking north along the river road, never to be seen again in Louisiana. Others claim he lingered, quietly surviving, working under an assumed name as a French tutor, quietly saving enough to journey beyond the state. Newspapers hint, whispering his presence in Cincinnati. Letters to the consulate, signed simply as J.B., attest to a life begun anew, a reclamation of freedom. Thomas, the stable hand who had delivered his desperate plea to the French consulate, claimed to have seen him walking at dawn 3 days after the auction, carrying a small bundle, smiling faintly, pressing a finger to his lips. Whether these tales were true or stories crafted by those who needed to believe in escape, no one can know. The consequences for Anatol, however, were undeniable. His business continued. His plantation remained profitable, but his reputation was tarnished irreparably. Families in New Orleans whispered among themselves, drawing subtle lines of distance. The story of the auction spread, carried in letters, in private conversation, in the quiet acknowledgement that Anatol had tried to sell his own nephew, had stolen a free man's papers, and had presided over the humiliation of someone whose humanity could not be denied. Whether Jean Baptiste was legally free mattered less than the moral rupture. Family honor, decency had been violated, and whispers of that violation lingered like smoke over the city. In 1859, years later, Anatol received a package with no return address. What it contained, whether threat or warning, remains uncertain, but by then, the damage to his name was complete. The world had witnessed, even if only in fragments, the failure of power to contain spirit. Jean Baptiste Dearu had emerged from the shadow of law and ledger, of auction block and ancestral claim, into a state that was neither fully defined nor entirely secure. Yet it was enough. Alive, aware, free to carve out a new existence in the vast and uncertain landscape of the world beyond Louisiana. He carried forward a story that would ripple through time, a story of resistance, survival, and the impossibility of true ownership over a human soul. And so, in the quiet spaces between official rulings, in the whispers of servants and the rustle of legal documents, the legend of Jean Baptiste Dearu lived on, a ghostly witness to the human spirit's refusal to be owned, a reminder that even in the darkest theaters of law, commerce, and cruelty, some lights cannot be extinguished, and some voices once raised echo forever. The book lay open on the small desk, its pages yellowed, its spine cracked. On the title page, in a sweeping, deliberate script, Someone had scrawled a single line, "We are brothers, we who suffer from the same wound." A quotation from the Count of Monte Cristo, yes, but also a message, a warning. Anatol recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Jean Baptiste. That night, the book vanished in flames, but not before Anatol's daughter Margaret glimpsed it, and later recorded it in her diary, the words surviving long after the fire consumed the paper. The reference was pointed. The Count of Monte Cristo tells of a man imprisoned unjustly, a man who escapes and exacts calculated vengeance on those who betrayed him. It is a story of transformation, of rebirth, of shedding one's old self, as a snake sheds its skin. Anatol took the message as a threat, though it could have been a mere observation, a note of parallel circumstance. Either way, he acted. Private investigators were dispatched to track Jean Baptiste's movements, but they found nothing. Security at the plantation tightened. Guards were stationed in corners, paths were monitored, windows barred. Anatol slept with a pistol at his side, his eyes darting at shadows that might conceal a boy who had already defied him. He began to decay mentally, physically, spiritually, far faster than his age should have allowed. Whispers among the servants spoke of muttered French conversations, arguments held with unseen interlocutors. A man consumed by his own obsession. He would pace, gesturing toward empty space, repeating the same frustrated lines, "I gave you shelter. I did what was necessary. Why can't you see that?" No one could say who he meant. The world had grown thin around him, and in that thinning his mind fractured. By 1862, during the Union occupation of New Orleans, Anatol died at 66, his body and spirit broken. The doctors called it nervous exhaustion and melancholia. Others whispered that he had been haunted, that his final weeks were consumed by visions of the boy who had refused to be owned. Christophe's death was simpler, quieter, yet no less poignant. He passed in New York 3 days before Jean Baptiste's declaration of freedom, unaware of his son's triumph. A nun attending him noted that he seemed unusually at peace in those final days. In a faint voice, he said, "My son is free. That is all that matters." Whether he knew Jean Baptiste specifically, or spoke in the delirium of impending death, no one could say. Perhaps, across the miles and the untraceable connection between parent and child, he had felt the boy escape, had sensed the reclamation of life and identity. The St. Louis Hotel continued its auctions for a decade, but the May 14, 1850, event the auction that had so spectacularly unraveled vanished from official records. Bills of sale, bidder agreements, ledgers documenting the suspension of the sale, all disappeared as if the building itself had swallowed them. But erasure is never complete. Stories persisted in French Creole homes, whispered in letters, retold in conversations over dinner, surviving the official attempt at obliteration. The tale of the beautiful young man who declared himself free on the auction block became legend, carried by memory rather than ink. Here is where history and truth begin to blur. The French consulate's confirmation of Jean Baptiste's citizenship was genuine. The Paris records were verifiable. Christophe's marriage legitimate. Anatol's claim of a slave named Celeste at Rivier Okan is untraceable. In the plantation's records before Jean Baptiste's arrival, no inventories, no birth records, no purchase or sale documents, nothing but testimony coached, manipulated, and designed to support a fiction. Anatol had not merely attempted to enslave a free man, he had fabricated history itself. He had rewritten reality, conjuring witnesses, shaping memory, constructing lies as carefully as a mason lays bricks. If that is true, then the auction was not a momentary miscarriage of justice. It was exposure, a revelation that power alone cannot make truth. And Jean Baptiste's disappearance begins to make sense. He was not merely fleeing enslavement, he was evading someone who had demonstrated the terrifying capacity to erase life, identity, and memory to preserve his lies. Survival was not enough, concealment was necessary. The final documented whisper of Jean Baptiste Dearu comes decades later. In 1897, Alberta Lacroix, a researcher chronicling New Orleans' French heritage, interviewed elderly Creoles. Madame Henriette Blanchard, aged 93, recounted the auction in vivid detail. The young man on the marble block, breathtakingly beautiful, declaring himself free as the crowd froze in disbelief. "You could see it in how he stood," she said. "Free people carry themselves differently. They hold their heads differently. That boy was free. He just had to prove it." When asked if she believed he survived where he might have gone, she smiled knowingly. "Somewhere cold," she said. "Somewhere his face meant nothing except that it was beautiful. Canada, maybe, or France. Somewhere the laws of Louisiana could not touch him. He lived long, quietly, and never told anyone what happened. Some secrets are too dangerous to speak aloud. You carry them, and they die with you. And perhaps that is the truth of it." Jean Baptiste Dearu survived the spectacle, the fraud, the betrayal. He escaped a man who would have destroyed him utterly, and in doing so became more than a boy, more than a record in a ledger, more than a footnote in history. He became a ghostly testament to the unbound human spirit, to the certainty that life, identity, and dignity cannot be fully possessed. And so, even as time passed, as plantations faded and auctions were forgotten, his story lingered in the shadow, whispered in Creole kitchens, echoed in letters hidden in desks, carried silently by those who remembered. He became a living legend, a proof that even in the darkest theaters of law, commerce, and cruelty, some lights remain untouchable, and some voices, once raised, echo forever. The Louisiana legislature's decision in 1853 to seal the auction records has cast a long shadow, a silent surge. Deliberate it hums with unease even today. Those documents, hidden from view for over a century and a half, are more than ink on paper. They are a secret, a dangerous truth someone thought the world was not ready to see. Every historian, every researcher who has petitioned for access has been denied. The official explanation always cites privacy concerns, claiming the need to protect potentially living descendants. But consider this, Jean Baptiste was born in 1829. Any direct descendants would now be generations removed, so privacy concerns hardly hold. The real reason for the secrecy must lie elsewhere. Perhaps the records contain evidence of Anatol's fraud, or the complicity of wealthy and influential families who colluded in the sale. Perhaps they reveal a crime so brazen, so deeply immoral, that exposing it would force institutions to admit wrongdoing, to apologize where no one wishes to apologize. Perhaps the documents hold the key to Jean Baptiste's flight, his reinvention, the path he took after vanishing from Louisiana's gaze. Somewhere, buried beneath the layers of time, is the answer to the question that has haunted countless minds for nearly 2 centuries. Did he survive? Did he truly escape the hands that sought to erase him? Did he build a new life under a new name, leaving behind the shadow of what he had endured? The fragments of evidence we do possess suggest survival, a quiet triumph against overwhelming odds. The letter to the French consulate in 1854 speaks of his freedom, the confiscation of his papers, the illegal attempt to enslave him. The book sent to Anatol in 1859, a subtle warning written in coded reference to the Count of Monte Cristo, signals a mind both clever and unbroken, a soul determined to leave a mark. The silence surrounding him, the complete absence of records showing he was recaptured, is itself a sign. In a world built on ledgers and receipts, a missing person is a scream in the dark. Jean Baptiste's absence is proof of his agency, his cunning, and his refusal to be reabsorbed into the machinery of oppression. Madame Blanchard's recollections, decades later, hint at the geography of his escape. "Somewhere cold," she said. Montreal, Boston, Paris, anywhere his beauty, his education, and his foreignness would be anonymous, unremarkable to those who might recognize him from that fateful day on the marble block. Perhaps he became a tutor, a clerk, a translator, occupations that allowed him to use his mind while keeping a low profile. Perhaps he married, had children, grew old, and died without ever recounting the 3 months in 1852 when the very world disputed his existence, debated his humanity, and attempted to strip his identity from him. And maybe that is exactly why we search for him still. Not because we need to locate a body, a name, death certificate in Montreal or Paris or Boston. Not because we require confirmation of his survival. We seek him because his story embodies something profound, something rare, the refusal to vanish. The vast machinery of erasure, of slavery, of systemic dehumanization, swallows most people like him whole. Their names are lost, their lives reduced to faint entries in forgotten ledgers, their stories untold. But Jean Baptiste did not vanish. He stood, he declared, he insisted on recognition. He forced the world to witness him, even if it could not entirely know what to do with him. On that marble platform, under the vast dome of the St. Louis Hotel, he did something almost unimaginable. He claimed his identity, asserting his humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. And then, having done so, he disappeared, not erased, but transformed. He chose invisibility on his own terms. That distinction is crucial. It is the difference between being consumed by forces beyond one's control and exerting agency in a world structured to deny it. He had reclaimed the power to define himself, even if only fleetingly. This story illuminates the fragility and the resilience of identity. In a world where a person's status could be dictated by skin, birth, or the whims of powerful relatives, Jean Baptiste's moment of defiance was radical, almost revolutionary. He should never have been on that auction block. Whether his birth in Paris rendered him free, or whether Louisiana law attempted to erase that freedom is less important than the truth that his very humanity became a question, an item to be bought or sold. Yet, in defying that system, he demonstrates the power of resistance, of naming oneself in the presence of those who would redefine you, reduce you, and dehumanize you. When Jean Baptiste spoke those 3 words, "I am free," he risked everything, yet in doing so, he altered the trajectory of his story, and in some way, the stories of all those who came after him. Legal or not, court decision or legislative loophole, his declaration transformed him from passive victim to active agent. That is the victory. That is the triumph that echoes through the decades, the reason we still tell his story, still whisper his name. And perhaps that is why the Louisiana legislature has kept those records sealed, hidden behind the official veil of privacy. The truth is explosive, dangerous, because it touches on something far greater than a single auction or a single life. It questions the foundations of power, of law, of complicity. It is the story of a man who refused to be a footnote in history, who stood on a public stage and ensured that the machinery of oppression could not fully consume him. These documents may contain proof of his flight, proof of his survival, the secrets of his new life, but they may also contain something far more uncomfortable for those who maintain control, evidence that systems, even when cloaked in legality, can be wrong, and that individuals with courage and cunning can still reclaim themselves. Jean Baptiste Dearu's life after the auction becomes almost mythic, blurring history and legend. Letters, books, whispered memories, and the faint traces of bureaucratic records give us glimpses, but never a complete picture. He becomes a shadow that cannot be extinguished, a living reminder that freedom is not only a legal status but a stance, a refusal to allow others to write your story for you. Even the absence of concrete evidence of his later years speaks volumes. He survived by erasure, by careful reinvention, by the quiet cunning of someone who understood the value of being unseen until the moment was right. We are drawn to Jean Baptiste Dearu not for certainty, but for the haunting proof that survival and agency can exist, even in the most hostile conditions. His is a story that outlives legislation, that outlasts the efforts of those who would erase him, and that reverberates through every whispered retelling, every letter hidden in a desk, every family story carried quietly across generations. He becomes a spectral witness, a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit. Even as time passes, even as records remain sealed, the legend persists, reminding us that identity is not something imposed, it is claimed, and it can never be fully stolen from those who assert it. And so we return to the question that lingers in the air, dense as the humid Louisiana heat. Did Jean Baptiste Dearu survive? Did he walk into the northern cities or across the Atlantic, assuming a new name, a new life, invisible but alive? Did he teach, translate, build, marry, age, and die, carrying the memory of those 3 months in 1852 when strangers debated his humanity, when strangers tried to buy and sell the very essence of who he was? Or is it not the answer to that question that matters most, but the very fact that he forced the world to confront him, even briefly, even imperfectly? We tell his story because it matters that someone refused to disappear, that he stood on that platform in front of hundreds of witnesses and said, "I am free," is a victory the records cannot erase, The auction cannot undo. The passage of decades cannot obscure. He took the power to define himself and wielded it when all else was stripped away. The machinery of slavery, commerce, and law could not contain him, could not fully possess him, could not take from him the most elemental truth, his voice, his name, his freedom. Jean Baptiste did not vanish. He transformed. He disappeared on his terms, leaving only traces, fragments, and the shadow of his defiance, waiting for those who care to see, to find, to imagine the life he lived afterward. And in the whisper of Creole kitchens, in letters tucked in desks, in the fragments of memory and the echoes of law, he continues to exist, a ghostly reminder of the human spirit's refusal to be owned. In the end, the story of Jean Baptiste Dearu is more than a tale of slavery, fraud, or legal ambiguity. It is a story of resistance, transformation, and survival. It is a story that endures because it illustrates a profound truth. Identity once claimed cannot be fully taken. Even in the darkest theaters of law, commerce, and cruelty, some lights cannot be extinguished, and some voices, once raised, echo forever. The question is no longer whether he survived, or where he went, or what became of him. The question is whether we will remember, whether we will recognize the courage it takes to stand, declare, and insist on being human when all else conspires to deny it. And that is why the story persists, still whispered, still searched for, still alive, waiting for the next witness, the next listener, the next seeker who dares to look for Jean Baptiste Dearu in the shadows of history, in the echoes of the past, in the unclaimed spaces where truth and legend intertwine.